No one could figure out how Carter Dynamics collapsed. Not the board, not the regulators, not even Daniel Carter himself. At least, not until a single encrypted file surfaced. What it revealed changed everything. The collapse of the billion-dollar empire wasn't an outside attack or corporate sabotage. It was planned. By Emily Carter, the woman Daniel once called his wife, and the one he believed was already gone from his life. Daniel Carter was one of New York's most powerful tech CEOs. A man known for control, precision, and relentless ambition. He had built Carter Dynamics from nothing, shaping it into a billion-dollar empire that demanded everything from him: time, energy, and eventually, even his humanity. Somewhere along the way, success changed him. The man Emily once fell in love with, the one who laughed easily and made her feel safe, slowly disappeared. In his place was someone distant, always calculating, always elsewhere, even when he was sitting right next to her. Emily was 7 months pregnant. From the outside, her life looked perfect. A luxury apartment. Financial stability. A powerful husband. But inside that beautiful space, she felt herself slipping further into loneliness. Still, she held on to hope. She told herself Daniel's silence wasn't permanent. That the distance was just stress. That once things slowed down, he'd come back to her, the way he used to be. That hope was what kept her going. That night, she tried again. She cooked dinner. Dimmed the lights. Waited for him. When he finally walked in, she greeted him gently, even smiling as she mentioned the baby moving inside her belly, hoping it would pull something real out of him again. But Daniel was barely there. He listened, but only halfway. His phone kept pulling him away. His answers were short, distracted, like his mind was locked in another world entirely, one filled with investors, deadlines, and pressure that never stopped. What Emily didn't know was how bad things had gotten. Daniel was under intense pressure from his board and investors. They were demanding expansion, growth, dominance, no matter the cost. Every message, every call carried the same underlying threat: adapt or lose everything. And slowly, that pressure reshaped his thinking. Emotions started to feel like distractions. Even family. Even love. Later that night, after Emily had gone quiet, Daniel sat alone in the dim light of his phone screen. A final confirmation came through from his legal and advisory team. If he wanted to protect his position, there could be no divided attention anymore. No emotional ties pulling him in two directions. In his mind, it stopped being a moral decision. It became strategy. The divorce papers were already prepared. When he placed them on the table, there was no anger, no visible hesitation. It didn't feel like the end of a marriage to him. It felt like closing a business deal that had already run its course. He told Emily calmly that it was over, that he needed to fully commit to the company and that their life together couldn't continue like this. At first, Emily didn't understand what she was hearing. Her mind refused to accept it, searching for another explanation. Stress. A misunderstanding. Anything but this. But when Daniel confirmed it was final, and mentioned a settlement of $50,000, something inside her went still. It wasn't a pause. It wasn't confusion. It was the end. She didn't cry in front of him. Not because she wasn't breaking inside, but because something in her refused to collapse in that moment, in front of him. She swallowed it all down and quietly stood up. Then she started packing. Slowly. Carefully. Like each movement cost her something. As she moved through the apartment, everything felt unfamiliar even though nothing had changed. The same furniture. The same lighting. The same silence. But it all felt different now. Heavier. Colder. Like the life she had been living there had already become someone else's memory. Daniel stayed where he was, watching without saying a word. He didn't try to stop her. Didn't explain. Didn't soften the blow. It was as if, in his mind, everything had already ended long before this conversation ever began. When Emily finally reached the front door, she paused. Her hand rested on the handle, but she didn't move right away. It felt like the entire weight of her life was pressing down on that single moment. Everything she had believed in, gone. Everything she had planned for their child, gone. The version of her future she trusted, gone. Before she left, she turned back one last time. Her voice was quiet, steady, but carrying something sharp beneath it. You think this is just a business decision, but you just ended a family. And one day, you'll understand exactly what you lost. Emily Carter left the luxury apartment without looking back. Not because it didn't matter anymore, but because looking back would have meant breaking in a way she wasn't ready to survive yet. That apartment, once a symbol of success and security, now felt like a sealed chapter of her life, closed without warning, without permission, without mercy. The $50,000 Daniel had given her sat untouched in her account. It existed, but it meant nothing. It couldn't soften the weight in her chest or fill the silence he left behind. She was carrying a child. But she was also carrying silence, confusion, and a kind of emotional exile she didn't yet have words for. She rented a small apartment on the quieter side of New York, far away from the glass towers and polished streets she once lived among. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't impressive. But it was hers. And after everything, that mattered more than anything else. The place was simple, basic furniture, thin walls, the occasional sound of neighbors bleating through at odd hours. Nothing like the world she had left behind. But for the first time in what felt like years, Emily wasn't living inside someone else's expectations. She was alone. And strangely, that was better than feeling lonely next to someone who no longer saw her. In the beginning, she cut off all contact. No calls. No messages. No explanations. No searching for closure that might not exist. Daniel didn't reach out either. And in the space between them, silence grew fast. Soon, the media filled it. Then speculation. Then stories. Then labels. She became the forgotten wife of a tech CEO. A headline that reduced her entire life into something disposable. Emily never responded. She learned quickly that silence from others could be loud, but reacting to it made it louder. So she stayed quiet. And endured it. The pregnancy made everything sharper. Some nights, she would sit by the window, one hand resting lightly on her stomach, feeling the faint movement of her unborn child. And she would just breathe through it all. Not the calm kind of breathing. The kind you do when you're trying not to fall apart. There were moments when sadness came without warning, heavy and sudden, like it had been waiting for her to slow down. And there were moments, short, fragile ones, where clarity returned. In those moments, she reminded herself of something simple. She didn't need to understand everything to survive it. What Daniel never knew was this. Emily's silence wasn't emptiness. It was control. She wasn't falling apart every second of the day. She was holding herself together with discipline, even when her emotions felt unstable beneath the surface. She built structure where there had been collapse. She cleaned her apartment every morning, even when she didn't feel like getting out of bed. She walked every afternoon, slowly, even when the world felt too heavy. At night, she wrote things down, thoughts, fragments, memories that didn't always make sense. But it gave her something to hold on to. Something that was hers. That routine became her anchor. Not healing. Not peace. Just stability. One evening, while going through old belongings, she found a forgotten folder tucked away in a box she hadn't opened in years. Inside were documents from her past life. Before Daniel. Before the empire. Before everything shifted. Papers from her time in investment analytics. A version of her she had slowly set aside without fully realizing it. Back then, she had been sharp with numbers. confident with data, comfortable in the world of markets and patterns. She had built her own identity in logic and analysis, one that didn't rely on anyone else's name. Seeing those pages again didn't feel like nostalgia. It felt like recognition. Like meeting someone she used to be. At first, she closed the folder again. Too distant. Too complicated. Too far removed from the life she was living now. But it stayed with her. So she opened it again the next day. Then again after that. Slowly, she began reading. Not out of ambition. Not out of revenge. But because something inside her wanted to remember. Outside her small apartment, life moved on without her. Daniel's company stayed in the news, new deals, new expansions, new appearances. He was seen at meetings. At events. Always composed. Always moving forward. There was no mention of her beyond carefully managed statements. And the world accepted that silence easily. Too easily. Inside her apartment, Emily built something quieter. A life that didn't announce itself. She followed markets during the day while managing her pregnancy in between. Some days she felt strong. Some days she didn't. But she kept going anyway. Not because she felt ready. But because stopping wasn't an option anymore. And slowly, something began to shift. The pain didn't disappear. It just stopped being shapeless. It started turning into focus. Into awareness. Into something structured. She stopped seeing herself only as someone who had been left behind. And started noticing what still remained. Memory. Understanding. Capability. Things that hadn't been taken. Only forgotten. Late one night, she sat at her small laptop, going through financial reports she had started reviewing again. The city outside was quiet. But her mind wasn't. For the first time since leaving Daniel, she didn't feel lost. Not healed. Not whole. But awake. She leaned back in her chair, one hand resting lightly on the table, and whispered to herself, not as a declaration, but as a quiet realization testing its own truth. He took everything from me, but he forgot who I used to be. The woman Daniel Carter had walked away from was never weak. Never lost. And never ordinary. That version of Emily Carter had simply been quiet for a while. Buried under marriage, routine, and the slow emotional erosion of a life built around someone else's ambition. But she was still there. She had never actually left. Before she became Daniel Carter's wife, Emily had lived in a very different world. A world of numbers instead of silence. Of patterns instead of emotions. She worked at a top-tier investment firm in New York, where she studied markets the way others studied people, closely, patiently, and without distraction. She wasn't loud. She didn't chase attention. But she saw things others missed. Early signals. Weak points. Hidden momentum shifts that most analysts only recognized after the damage was already done. Her reports were simple on the surface. But they were right more often than anyone liked to admit. Back then, people didn't call her someone's wife. They called her an analyst who could see around corners. She had left that life quietly. Not because she failed. Not because she was forced out. But because she believed she was choosing something bigger. At the time, Daniel's career was accelerating fast, and she told herself that stepping back was support, that stability at home mattered just as much as ambition in the boardroom. It didn't feel like sacrifice then. It felt like partnership. Only later did she realize how easily a life can erase you when you stop actively defending your own identity. Now, in her small apartment, that buried version of herself started waking up again. Slowly at first. Like muscle memory returning after years of silence. She began reading again, financial reports, market breakdowns, industry analyses, late at night while the city outside kept moving without her. It didn't feel like studying. It felt like remembering. Some concepts came back instantly. Others took time. But the language of markets, once distant, started becoming familiar again in her hands. And almost without meaning to, her attention drifted toward Carter dynamics. At first, it wasn't personal. It was instinct. She looked at public filings the way she used to, detached, analytical, careful not to assume more than the data showed. But that distance didn't last. Because the more she read, the more something felt off. Not wrong in an obvious way. Not broken. Just slightly misaligned. Like a structure being pushed faster than it was designed to move. Carter dynamics looked strong from the outside. Impressive growth. Aggressive expansion. Bold international moves that investors seemed to love. But Emily stopped looking at the headlines and started looking underneath them. That's where the cracks usually were. Revenue projections depended heavily on future deals that weren't guaranteed yet. Expansion costs were being absorbed through layered financial structures that created flexibility, but also hidden exposure. On paper, it looked like dominance. But to her, it felt like pressure building too quickly behind glass. Pretty. Polished. And quietly unstable. She didn't tell anyone. Not Daniel. Not the media noise still circling her name. Not even the few people she still trusted immediately.
Instead, she reached out carefully to old contacts from her investment days. People who still lived in that world of risk models and corporate exposure. The conversations were casual at first, just catching up, just asking opinions, nothing specific. But slowly, patterns started forming. And those patterns confirmed what she already suspected. She wasn't imagining it. Even with everything happening in her body, her pregnancy, the exhaustion, the physical weight of each passing week, Emily built a rhythm. Appointments in the morning, reading in the afternoon, analysis at night, rest somewhere in between when her body forced her to stop. But mentally, she didn't drift anymore. Something had changed. She wasn't rebuilding herself emotionally. She was reconstructing herself intellectually, piece by piece. The deeper she went, the clearer Carter dynamics became. She started mapping connections between subsidiaries, tracking how one aggressive expansion decision quietly fed pressure into another. It wasn't one big failure point. It was a chain. A system that worked perfectly until one link stopped holding. And then everything around it would have to carry the weight. One night, something stood out. A set of offshore transactions tied to a recent expansion didn't align with normal financial behavior. It wasn't obvious at first glance. But once she traced it across reports, it became harder to ignore. The structure wasn't random. It was layered, intentional, designed to move capital in ways that made exposure harder to see in real time. At first, she tried to dismiss it as a reporting inconsistency. But the pattern didn't disappear when she looked closer. It sharpened. Her instincts, once trained in real boardroom-level analysis, kicked in fully. This wasn't noise. It was a signal. So she expanded the scope of her review, pulling data across quarters, comparing timelines, mapping dependencies. And slowly, something larger started to emerge. Not collapse. Not yet. But vulnerability. Hidden inside complexity. Delayed by structure. Protected by confidence. That night, she finally leaned back from her laptop, one hand resting lightly over her stomach. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet for what she was holding in her head. She wasn't just looking at numbers anymore. She was looking at a system that could fail under the right pressure. A company expanding faster than its foundations could safely support. And the most dangerous part wasn't what was visible. It was what hadn't been acknowledged yet. For a long moment, she just sat there. Then it hit her fully. This wasn't just analysis anymore. It wasn't just her remembering who she used to be. It was something sharper than that. Something active. Something real. Carter Dynamics wasn't just growing. It was exposed. And Emily Carter, quiet, overlooked, written off, was suddenly the only person who could see exactly where it would break. Emily Carter didn't react the way most people would have. There was no shock, no spiral, no emotional collapse, just stillness. A very specific kind of stillness, the kind that doesn't come from peace, but from control. For the first time since leaving Daniel, she didn't feel like someone who had been pushed out of a life. She felt like someone standing outside it on purpose, watching, measuring, understanding. And in that quiet shift, she made her first real move. It started small, almost invisible. She created a consulting profile under a name that had nothing to do with her past. No ties to New York finance circles. No trace of Carter. No version of herself that anyone could recognize. Just a clean, neutral identity. Professional. Generic. Forgettable. That was the point. She wasn't building a personality. She was building access. From there, she didn't rush. She entered online financial forums and analyst spaces where professionals spoke openly about markets, corporate risk, and instability patterns in global firms. At first, she barely spoke at all. She just read, watched how people interpreted uncertainty, watched what they missed. And slowly, without announcing herself, she started slipping into the rhythm of those conversations, close enough to see everything, far enough that no one saw her. Every day, her attention came back to one thing: Carter dynamics. She tracked its movement like a pulse she refused to ignore. Stock behavior, trading volume shifts, investor reactions, press statements. On the surface, everything looked clean, even impressive. Controlled growth, strong confidence, carefully managed optimism. But Emily wasn't looking at the surface anymore. She was watching for the space between what was said and what the numbers quietly admitted. It didn't take long. Certain patterns started repeating. Price movements that didn't fully align with announcements. Valuation shifts that felt slightly delayed, almost as if the market was reacting to something after it had already been softened. Nothing obvious enough to raise alarms on its own. But together, it felt coordinated. Like information wasn't just being released. It was being timed. Then one night, something changed. A message appeared in one of the encrypted channels she had been monitoring. No name, no profile, just a fragment of text that looked like it had been sent without full intention. Almost like hesitation. The message referenced irregularities inside Carter Dynamics' reporting structure. And worse, it suggested someone else had already been tracking the same patterns. Someone inside the system. Or close enough to it. Emily didn't respond. Not even for a second. She didn't treat it like a conversation. She treated it like a signal. Something to be tested, not trusted. Instead, she went deeper. She started gathering fragmented leaks, small documents, partial datasets, anonymous uploads scattered across different channels. Individually, they meant almost nothing. Incomplete, unverified, easy to dismiss. But Emily didn't look at them one by one. She layered them, compared timestamps, cross-checked patterns, connected fragments that were never meant to sit side by side. And slowly, something began to take shape. To confirm what she was seeing, she went back to tools she hadn't touched in years. Old systems from her investment days. The kind used to trace corporate structures, validate disclosures, and expose hidden dependencies inside financial networks. It felt strange at first, like using a language she hadn't spoken in a long time. But muscle memory returned quickly. Too quickly. And with each layer she verified, the picture stopped being vague. Carter Dynamics wasn't just expanding aggressively. It was built on layered exposure, delayed risk, hidden dependencies masked as strategic growth. From the outside, it looked like momentum. From the inside, it looked like pressure held together by timing. And timing only works until it doesn't. Days blurred together. Morning appointments, pregnancy fatigue, late-night analysis, silence in between. Her apartment slowly turned into a controlled space of structure, Documents organized with precision, notes categorized, patterns mapped and remapped until they stopped feeling like guesses and started feeling like architecture. She wasn't reacting anymore. She was building. And somewhere along the way, something inside her changed again. The pain didn't disappear. It just stopped bleeding. It was still there, quiet, persistent, but no longer in charge. What took its place was colder, clearer, more deliberate. She wasn't thinking about Daniel as a person anymore. Not really. She was thinking about the system around him, the structure he trusted, the company he believed was untouchable, and where it might break if someone applied pressure in the right place. Every new discovery added another piece. Carter Dynamics wasn't a single machine. It was a network of dependencies stacked on top of each other, each one relying on the next to keep confidence intact. As long as growth continued, everything held. But if growth slowed, the structure wouldn't just weaken. It would expose itself. And that was when Emily realized something she hadn't admitted out loud yet. She wasn't just observing anymore. She wasn't just analyzing. She was designing something. Quietly.
Carefully.
Without calling it anything that sounded emotional enough to be dangerous. Not revenge. Not anger. Something more controlled than that. Something built entirely from information and timing. One evening, she paused mid-review. Her hand rested lightly over her stomach without her noticing at first, grounding herself without meaning to. Her eyes stayed on the screen, but her thoughts had already moved further ahead than the data in front of her. Something had fully shifted. She wasn't outside the system anymore. She was learning how to move inside it, without being seen, without being stopped. Then her screen flickered. A new message. Unknown sender. No traceable origin. Just a few words that made the room feel suddenly smaller. If you really want the truth about Daniel Carter, you are already too late. What Emily Carter found behind Daniel's empire didn't look like success anymore. Not when you stopped reading it the way investors were meant to. Not when you looked closely enough to see what was underneath. Carter Dynamics, on the surface, was exactly what the world believed it to be, a rising global tech giant with strong growth, bold expansion, and unwavering confidence. But the deeper Emily went, the more that image started to fracture. Not all at once. Quietly. Then all at once anyway. She started with what she already had. Public filings. Investor reports. Financial summaries. The kind of information designed to reassure people, not reveal anything meaningful. At first, everything looked clean enough to pass. Nothing illegal on the surface. Nothing obvious enough to trigger alarms. But Emily wasn't looking for obvious anymore. She was looking for gaps. And the gaps were there. Small at first. Almost easy to ignore. Revenue spikes that landed too perfectly around investor updates. Losses that seemed softened rather than reported. Timing that felt too controlled, like the numbers weren't just being reported, they were being paced. It wasn't chaos. It was precision. And that made it worse. The first real fracture came when she studied valuation behavior more closely. The growth being presented to the market didn't fully match real-world indicators. Not in a way that screamed fraud. In a way that whispered management of perception. Emily had seen aggressive accounting before in her old career. Companies stretching reality to look stronger than they were. But this wasn't just stretching. This was layered. Built in stages. Protected by structure. Then she found the offshore network. And everything shifted. At first, it looked like standard international structuring, accounts in jurisdictions that large corporations often used for flexibility and tax planning. Nothing unusual on its own. Until she tracked how the money actually moved. It wasn't sitting still. It was flowing through a chain of shell companies. Each one registered in a different jurisdiction. Each one designed to break visibility. And when she mapped it out, a pattern emerged that didn't belong in normal corporate behavior. This wasn't just movement. It was concealment. Emily stopped for a long time when she realized what she was seeing. Internal debt wasn't being reported where it should have been. It was being shifted off the visible balance sheet, buried inside structures that technically existed, but only on paper. To the outside world, Carter Dynamics looked strong, stable, even dominant. But underneath that image, A significant portion of its financial obligation had been quietly displaced, hidden in places investors were never meant to look. She didn't trust the conclusion at first, so she rebuilt it, piece by piece, manually tracing transactions, cross-checking disclosures, running old verification models she hadn't used in years. Each layer she confirmed made the structure clearer and more fragile. This wasn't just aggressive growth. It was controlled exposure management, a system designed to hold as long as confidence didn't break. Then the anonymous messages returned. Stronger this time. More precise. Not warnings anymore, fragments. Internal documents. Risk notes. Partial emails. Transaction summaries that never should have left the company's ecosystem. Someone inside Carter Dynamics wasn't just watching. They were leaking. Or preparing to disappear. Emily didn't rush. She never responded emotionally. But she did something more deliberate. She reached out, carefully, to a former assistant of the company's CFO. Someone who had left quietly. No clear explanation. No public story. Just gone. The conversation, when it finally happened, was short, controlled, careful on both sides. But it confirmed what Emily already suspected. There had been internal warnings. Not rumors. Warnings. About financial manipulation that had been escalating over time. About reporting structures that were being pushed beyond safe limits. And about decisions that had been ignored, not because they weren't understood, but because stopping them would have meant exposing everything already built on top of them. That was the part that stayed with her. Not fraud. Not even scale. But continuity. The system hadn't started this way. It had grown into it. And now it couldn't stop without collapsing under its own weight. Emily began organizing everything. Not like someone reacting. Like someone constructing something precise. Every document had a place. Every pattern had a label. Every confirmation had to survive review more than once before it became real in her mind. What she was building wasn't just a case. It was a map. A full structure of vulnerability hidden inside a billion-dollar illusion. And the more complete it became, the more unavoidable the conclusion was. Carter Dynamics wasn't stable. It was dependent, not on strength, but on belief. Investor belief, market belief, public belief. And belief, once broken, doesn't correct itself gently. It collapses. Emily felt it, even as she stayed disciplined. The weight of it. Not emotional chaos, but consequence. Real consequence. Sometimes she would pause and rest a hand over her stomach, grounding herself in something immediate, something alive, something that didn't exist in spreadsheets or financial models. Then she would return to the data, because stopping didn't change what was already there. Late one night, she finally saw it clearly. Not in fragments, not in pieces, but as a complete system. Carter Dynamics wasn't just hiding debt. It was holding itself together through carefully managed distortion, layered, sustained, and dependent on continued confidence from the outside world. And if that confidence broke, there wouldn't be a slow correction. There would be a drop. A real one. She closed her laptop slowly. The room was quiet, but her mind wasn't. There was no confusion left now. Only clarity. And clarity, she realized, was heavier than doubt ever was. For the first time since she began this path, she spoke out loud, not to question what she had found, but to acknowledge what it meant. Because there was no softer version of it anymore. No partial outcome. No controlled damage. Only scale. If I expose this, she said quietly, almost like she was testing the words for weight. Daniel loses everything in one night. It didn't start with an explosion. There was no dramatic announcement. No single moment that signaled the end. Carter Dynamics began to fall the way things often do when they've been standing on hidden pressure for too long. Quietly at first, almost politely. Like the system was simply forgetting how to hold itself together. Daniel Carter noticed something was wrong before he understood what it meant. The numbers stopped behaving with their usual obedience. Carter Dynamics stock dipped in a way that didn't match anything happening in the market. Analysts called it a correction. A temporary reaction. A healthy reset after aggressive growth. But it didn't stop. It deepened. Then it accelerated. Within days, confidence started turning into hesitation. Large investors were the first to move. Quiet exits, carefully timed withdrawals, no public explanation. Then mid-level partners followed. Then smaller accounts reacted to the movement above them. And suddenly, what had looked like a stable giant began to feel fragile. Not officially, not on paper, but in behavior. And in markets, behavior is everything. Inside Carter Dynamics, the mood changed just as fast. Board meetings lost their certainty. Reports were questioned instead of accepted. Every update felt like it might be hiding something. Daniel sat at the center of it all, composed the way he always was in crises. Still, controlled, careful, but something around him had shifted. People didn't look at him the same way anymore. Not with trust, with calculation, as if they were deciding how close they could safely stand to a falling structure. Then the regulators arrived. Quietly, at first. No public statements. No headlines. Just the kind of investigation that begins behind closed doors long before the world is allowed to notice. And almost immediately after that, the leaks started appearing. Fragments of internal documents. Offshore structures no one had expected to see in public. Hidden liabilities. Irregular reporting patterns. Nothing fully complete on its own, but together, they formed something far more dangerous than any single accusation. A pattern. Daniel reacted the only way he knew how. Control. Lockdowns. Internal audits. Cybersecurity teams. External consultants. Every possible system activated at once. He wanted the source. He needed the source. Because, in his world, problems had origins. And origins could be removed. But nothing came back clean. Every investigation hit dead ends. Every trace looped into something incomplete. It was as if the system had been understood in advance, mapped, studied, and dismantled in a way that left no obvious fingerprints behind. That's when the first real crack appeared in Daniel himself. Not fear. Confusion. The more he tried to control it, the less the system responded to him. Still, one thought never crossed his mind. Emily Carter. To him, she belonged to a closed chapter of his life. A personal decision. A memory sealed behind logic and ambition. He never connected her to systems. Never to structure. Never to anything that could reach this level of precision. And that blind spot, quiet, natural, unquestioned, was exactly what made him vulnerable. Inside the boardroom, panic replaced strategy. Partners who once followed Daniel without hesitation began questioning decisions openly. Others stopped arguing entirely and started planning exits instead. Assets were moved quietly. Positions were reduced. Exposure was minimized. No one wanted to be tied to a company that might not stabilize again. And with every departure, confidence weakened further. Daniel noticed it. Of course he did. But he misread it. He thought it was temporary instability. A reaction to pressure. A problem that would resolve once the leaks were contained. He still believed the system would return to balance. He didn't realize the system was already beyond that point. Because trust, once it begins to break, doesn't wait for permission to collapse. It accelerates. Quietly. Then, all at once. And from a distance, Emily Carter watched it unfold. She didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. She didn't chase attention, headlines, or acknowledgement. She simply observed the system responding to pressure she had carefully placed over time. Not in one strike. Not in one moment. But in layers. Each one small enough to be dismissed alone. Together, impossible to ignore. She stayed calm through all of it. Not detached, but controlled. The kind of control that comes from understanding exactly what is happening and choosing not to interrupt it. Every reaction in the market, she studied. Every movement in sentiment, she tracked. Every shift in confidence, she measured. And when needed, she adjusted nothing more than timing. Daniel's world, however, was becoming narrower, more frantic, more aggressive. Internal surveillance expanded. Meetings grew longer. Accusations started replacing strategy. He began questioning people he had trusted for years. But every move only made things worse. The tighter he pulled, the faster the structure slipped through his hands. Then came the report. It wasn't a headline, not a leak, not a public disclosure. It was internal, filtered through compliance layers before it ever reached him. Carefully written, hesitant in tone. Like, even the sender didn't want to be responsible for its meaning. The source of the leak is linked to someone from your past, Emily Carter. For a moment, Daniel didn't react. The words stayed still on the page, as if they didn't belong to reality yet. Just information. Not meaning. Not possibility. Just data waiting for permission to become real. But it did become real. Slowly. Uncomfortably. And then all at once. Across the city, Emily closed her laptop. The latest market reaction had already confirmed what she expected. Pressure spreading. Confidence weakening. Stability breaking down exactly where she had predicted it would. No celebration followed. No satisfaction. Just recognition. Because she wasn't watching a collapse anymore. She was watching a system respond to truth it had spent years avoiding. And for the first time, Daniel Carter wasn't steering the outcome. He was reacting to it. And somewhere inside that same silence, the next message was already forming. Inside the ruins of the empire he thought was untouchable. A message that would finally force him to understand what he had refused to see all along. The woman he had left behind was no longer behind him at all. She was ahead of him. It didn't fall in a moment. Carter dynamics collapsed the way systems collapse when they've been under pressure for too long and no one notices the cracks forming anymore. Quietly, then all at once. Emily Carter didn't announce anything. She didn't warn anyone. She didn't need to. By the time she acted, everything she had been building, every document, every pattern, every hidden structure she had carefully verified, had already formed something complete in her hands. Not emotion, not impulse, a system of truth. And once she released it, there was no way to unsee it. The impact was immediate. Not slow, not uncertain, immediate. Within hours, Carter Dynamics stock didn't just drop, it broke. Trading systems froze as automatic protections kicked in. Panic spread faster than analysis could catch up. Institutional investors pulled out first, then funds, then partners who had once treated Daniel Carter's name like a guarantee of safety. But guarantees don't survive exposure. Inside the company, everything unraveled at once. Emergency meetings were held, but no one was really in control anymore. Every department brought different answers. Every report contradicted the last. Blame started moving faster than solutions. And underneath it all, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't coming from outside. Someone inside the system had understood it too well, and used that understanding against it. Daniel Carter tried to hold the structure together. He didn't panic immediately. That came later. At first, it was disbelief, then denial, then control. Tight, desperate, sharp. But control doesn't work when the system no longer listens to you. Within hours, he was removed. Not through negotiation, not through discussion, but through pressure that had become too large for even the board to ignore. The same people who once protected him now stepped away from him completely. Carefully. Quietly. As if proximity itself had become dangerous. And just like that, Daniel Carter stopped being the center of his own empire. Then came the legal system. Investigations. Subpoenas. Financial reviews. Asset freezes. It didn't feel like one event. It felt like doors closing one after another. Communication restricted. Authority stripped. Access removed. Not violently. Just officially. The kind of removal that leaves no room for argument. And through all of it, Emily said nothing. No statement. No appearance. No reaction for the public to consume. Because she wasn't participating in the collapse emotionally. She had already finished that part long before anyone else understood what was happening. Now, she was only watching the outcome settle. The world didn't take long to start asking questions. At first, it was confusion. Then curiosity. Then investigation. Analysts tried to trace the origin of the collapse, looking for a single trigger, a single event, a single mistake. But what they found instead was consistency. Precision. Timing that didn't look accidental. And slowly, a name began surfacing in quiet financial circles. Not loudly. Not officially. But enough to be repeated. Emily Carter. At first, it was speculation. then correlation, then recognition. Because the more people studied the collapse, the more impossible it became to explain without her. Not as a participant, as the structure behind it, a mind that didn't act emotionally but systematically, carefully, correctly. Soon, she was given a name she never asked for: the silent billion-dollar mind. It spread because no simpler explanation fit. She hadn't destroyed an empire in anger. She had dismantled it with understanding. Daniel tried to reach her, at first through formal channels, then through intermediaries, then through people who once knew both of them. Each attempt failed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just nothing came back. No response, no acknowledgement, no opening left. For the first time in his life, Daniel experienced something he couldn't negotiate with: absence. Across the city, Emily's life didn't stop. It continued, quietly, deliberately, as if everything she had done so far was only one part of a longer path she had already accepted. Her pregnancy reached its final stage during the collapse, but she didn't slow down in the way people expected, because she had already prepared for this moment long before it arrived. And then life shifted again, not as an idea, as reality. Her child was born. No headlines marked it. No systems reacted. The world kept moving as if nothing had changed. But for Emily, everything had. The hospital room was quiet in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Not empty, just still. She held her child close, and for the first time in a long time, there was no calculation running in the background of her thoughts. No survival mode. No strategy. Just presence. Later, standing by the window, she looked out at the city. It didn't feel smaller. It felt clearer. Like something that used to be overwhelming had finally been placed into perspective. She wasn't inside anyone else's world anymore. Not Daniel's. Not the systems. Not the past's. Daniel Carter's empire was gone. Not just weakened. Not just reduced. Gone. Replaced by investigations, records, and consequences that no longer answered to him. Everything he had built around control had ended in a structure he could no longer influence. But Emily didn't feel victory the way people expected her to. There was no celebration in her expression. No need to frame it as revenge anymore. That chapter had already finished itself. What remained now was something quieter, more permanent. She looked down at her child, and in that moment, something settled inside her completely. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something steadier. Understanding. Direction. Responsibility. Her voice was barely above a whisper, not as a declaration to the world, but as a truth meant only for the life she now held in her arms. He taught me how to survive alone. A pause. Then softer. Now I will teach you how to build something that never has to survive anything at all.